Okay, let's get started. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's joined the webinar virtually. Um, we are really excited to talk about the work that SAMA is doing and how it can impact student retention in the university system and improve science education and make it accessible to all different types of learners. What we're going to be doing is I'm going to go through about 20 to 25 minutes, just kind of explaining what SAMA is doing, how we're doing it, and what the results of some efficacy work that we've done are, and then how we look to work together with higher ed institutions. And then we'll open it up for the last 15 minutes to have a discussion, answer any questions you guys might have, and hopefully learn some things from you guys about what your needs and pain points are at your specific institution. So let's see if there we go. SAMA Learning is a team founded by myself and Barb DeHart, and we are joined by two developers who are the core engineering team for SAMA, Justin Busan and DeLorean Lathers. My background is I have a PhD in chemistry from UCLA, where my background, as I was mentioning, is I have a PhD in chemistry from UCLA, where I TA'd for 5 of the 6 years that I was there to lecture halls of large lecture halls of students. And since then, I am a staff scientist at SLAC National Lab, just up the hill from Stanford, and run a research group that investigates how to utilize artificial intelligence to accelerate the development of new materials for renewable energy. And the concept for SAMA arose when I was driving down to teach a class at Stanford on light matter interaction. And the way that I typically teach that class is to write equations of Fourier transforms on a board for 55 minutes. And I generally put 98% of my students to sleep. And this time, I was fortunate enough to be listening to a report out of the Consumer Electronics Show talking about virtual reality, which was right when the Oculus DevKit 1 was released. And had a moment of insight that, hey, if I could use this tool to put students on a crystalline lattice, it's a way that at least conceptually they would understand what these mathematics I'm going to explain are underpinning. And even if they don't fully grasp the totality of the mathematics, they walk away with a conceptual understanding of how this behavior works. And that led to thinking about all of the other ways that we can apply virtual reality in education. And the way we're going about doing that is what I'm going to explain here. I was joined by my co-founder, Barb DeHart, who spent her career in media as an executive in the media and entertainment technology sector, developing many of the behind the scenes tools that enable all the streaming that we all take for granted today. And Justin and DeLorean come to us from the mobile development world, and we have turned them into lovers and believers in virtual reality and how the experience you get out of a virtual reality simulation is so much better than what you can get out of this thing right here. So let's talk a little bit about who SAMA is. So at SAMA, our mission, really what we were founded around, is to accelerate STEM graduation rates and make science, technology, engineering, and mathematics accessible to all different types of students, regardless of what your remediations needs are, regardless of what your learning styles have been effective for you in the past, and really just increase access to STEM content. And through that, to foster a love for learning. And I can say the thing I love most about the job I have held for the last 11 years is that every day I come to work and I get to learn something new. And I just want to bring that same love of learning to all different types of students. So that's who we are as a company. And really, we were founded around this mission of how do we increase STEM retention rates? So many people I talk to have their anecdotal experience is always that science was hard, mathematics was hard, there were things I didn't want to do. Now, consequently, they all went into business and make 3 times my salary, but that's a different story. But when we looked into the research around what is impacting retention at our universities, we saw that nationally, the STEM retention rate to graduate in 6 years was 40%. And there was a report that came out of the Obama White House in 2011 that looked at the reasons why the STEM retention rate was what it was. And then they funded through the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education a series of studies that looked at strategies to mitigate the vast amount of leavers out of the STEM pipeline. And the kind of findings of that body of research generally were that A, you need to diversify teaching methods. Most instructors teach the way that they themselves learned. And so it is a process that inherently is self-selective. Most of those people went on to get PhDs and continue to study for a very long time. They are not going to necessarily have learned something the way a very, very diverse student body is going to uptake information. And so you have to diversify your teaching practices. Secondly, you need to use evidence-based teaching methods. So when I was first teaching my first class of general chemistry, I had 1 hour of instruction about how to teach. I didn't know anything about what I was doing. I was just thrown into a classroom of 300 students and said, go crazy. Now we know that when we used evidence-based practices, we can constantly evaluate what was effective and what wasn't, and use that to improve learning outcomes of our students. The number one remediation need is mathematics across all subjects. We need ways to improve mathematical competency, and this can include things like subject-specific mathematical remediation. Really focusing in on those first 2 years of university STEM instruction. So that general education curriculum that you have to take for your science requirement, that first or second year that you are taking STEM classes disproportionately affects dropout rates by an enormous amount. If you do a letter grade worse in your STEM classes relative to the other courses you are taking, your likelihood of leaving the STEM major increases by 60%. And so that's where we've chosen to focus, is on those first 2 years of STEM instruction. And we'll dive more into that in a little bit. And then lastly, we know that the social experience is important as human beings. And so we need ways to foster learning communities where the students have peer-to-peer relationships that reinforce what they're doing in the classroom. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we took these findings and built the SAMA products and what components of this we built into it. There we go. Oh, so before I start, I'm going to show you a little video of what one of our virtual reality lessons looks like. So the SAMA VR lessons are designed to be comprehensive lessons on a specific topical area that you can drop right alongside your existing curriculum. These lessons include advanced visualization. They're entirely immersive. The student is in control of the environment. They have narration and exposition as a setup for active learning activities for the students. So here there's a prompt, for example, that we want the student to build the electronic structure of carbon. This is a lesson on quantum mechanics that the students are take as part of their kind of week 3 in general chemistry curriculum. The student is guided through a set of exploration as well as integrated assessment. So there are quiz questions that are placed throughout the VR lessons and with feedback based on how the student answers the quiz questions. And then if at any points the students are getting stuck, we add tool tips and learning hints for the students to get access to. And so initially we built this single lesson on quantum mechanics and went out to a number of schools and talked to many, many professors to understand what they felt their pain points were in their instruction right now. And what we arrived at is really a consensus from those stakeholders of why VR is going to be so disruptive to education. And the first piece, overwhelmingly, we were talking largely to STEM professors, was purely the visualization piece. So just being able to visualize things like electromagnetic fields, quantum mechanical orbitals, how atoms bond together to form molecules, what a free body diagram looks like in 3 dimensions for physics. These were all visualizations that the instructors felt they didn't have an existing tool that met the needs that they wanted. And what they were seeing in the VR lesson was something that was above and beyond what was out there through kind of JavaScript, things like PhET on the web or anything like that. The second piece is that because we can build a complete virtual environment, we can take 50 years of education research, distill it down to what we know are best practices because there is evidence behind them. And we can build structured lessons using that education research so that we're not just presenting a simulation to a professor that they then get to decide on the pedagogy around. We can build the best pedagogy in a virtualized lesson. And then next, we can use data science to track what parts of the lesson students are engaging in, what components of the pedagogy are effective, and which parts of that could be changed or mitigated or different types of learners want to engage in. And so we can build a data science feedback loop that looks at what the students are doing in the lesson and what their learning outcomes are, and then continue to improve the product based on those things. So as I mentioned, we really wanted to look at, there's a huge body of work on education science. Implementation of the outcomes of that research tend to be fragmented. And we think one of the powerful things about VR is that we can essentially export a really strong pedagogy to institutions without asking their instructors to rewrite their entire curriculum. But for that to work, we need to be rooted in what we know is effective. And so these are things that are really straightforward to do in a virtual environment, are things like using active learning. So in all of our lessons right now, the student is giving some exposition that explains the concept that's underlying, and then they are led to a series of activities that they need to complete to move the lesson forward. We can also do things like project-based inquiry. So that last example I showed you in that short video where a student was building Carbon, they had to synthesize a set of knowledge to complete that step in the project. As I mentioned as well, building your lessons on an existing learning taxonomy is the #1 way that you can identify where structural deficiencies in your pedagogy are. And so we base all of the SAMA lessons on a learning taxonomy that we've developed. And then we know that assessment and feedback are critical for the student's metacognition. So it's not only a tool to let the student know in real time how they're doing on with a specific learning objective, but it's a tool that allows the student to build a cycle of confidence building that is going to help them to continue to persist in the STEM field. And most important to everything is that we have to use data-driven practices. We can't base our pedagogical developments or our technology implementations on hunches. We have to have methods in place that make it really, really straightforward to collect the data that's needed at all of the end user levels. So whether you are an administrator, a technologist, an instructor, or a student, you're going to get the feedback that you need, and we as a company are going to get the feedback we need to continue to improve the product in a data-driven way. So let's talk a little bit more about data-driven. So the first step of data-driven is to base your pedagogy on a learning framework. And the learning framework that we have been developing takes what is known from education science. So let's take something like Bloom's revised taxonomy or Marzano's taxonomy, and then we engage with content experts, experts in spatial computing, and experts in data science to adapt those learning taxonomies for the virtual environments and for the data-driven improvement of those taxonomies. And so our approach at SAMA for any content that we would ever develop is to bring these 4 groups of people together and use the learning taxonomy that we have in place and allow them the power to iterate on that taxonomy based on the data that we've gathered from existing lessons. And so every piece of content that we develop has these 4 people in the room. So getting back to the data-driven piece, you can see this is an overwhelming theme in everything that I'm going to talk about. This might come out of the fact that I'm a scientist by training, and data does not lie to me too often. We went out and ran an efficacy study on our early pilot lesson. So we built a pilot lesson that was around 25 minutes, intended for 25 minutes of time the student to spend in there on quantum mechanics that a general chemistry student gets in their freshman curriculum. So this is in the first semester of general chemistry that you take at university, community college, etc. We took that lesson and we delivered it to 1,000 students across 3 universities. Those universities were Stanford, Chico State, and Loyola Marymount. Google was kind enough to provide hardware for this study. And what we really wanted to look at here were to answer a couple of questions. A, can we implement virtual reality in the classroom at these kind of scales? B, what are the learning outcome improvements that the students see from integrating virtual reality alongside everything that's already happening in the classroom? So not changing the pedagogy that exists in the classroom except to add the VR lessons into it. And then we evaluated student learning outcomes with either a pre-post methodology or an experimental and control split. We had 3 very, excuse me, 1 second. Better. We had 3 very different universities, and each of these universities had different needs. And we've seen this kind of repeated for all the customers that we've onboarded to date. And so we've developed 3 different strategies that we think work across the different systems that we've worked with. At CSU Chico, they do not have an integrated lab activity with their general chemistry curriculum. So it's purely a series of lectures each week and then outside of class homework. And so this was assigned as an out-of-class assignment to the students. The Media and Entertainment Technology Department provided a space where the students could go in groups of 25 to take the VR lesson. And they took the lesson after they had had the lecture, done the reading, and done homework on the material. So the VR lesson really served as reinforcement for what the topics that they were supposed to be learning that week. At Stanford, they do have an integrated lab activity as part of the general education course. And so in that case, they integrated the use of VR side by side with the wet lab chemistry that was happening in the lab. So you can kind of see back here in the corner, there's some students back in a hood, while there's a group of students in the forefront running the virtual lesson. And this model worked well for Stanford because they used the virtual reality lesson to describe the conceptual underpinnings of what the students were doing in the laboratory. And at Loyola Marymount, similar to Chico, they didn't have a integrated lab or discussion section alongside the existing lecture. And so there they assigned the students, assign the students this as an outside of class homework assignment. The difference was that the headsets were left in a room that the students could freely access at any point in time. And so they're able to kind of just drop in model. This is probably the most similar to what we'd anticipate a model where the library or media or entertainment technology team runs the distribution of the hardware. So in each of these 3 schools, again, the methodology of the study was that we delivered the students had their normal instruction. They were then given a pre-test, then they were given the virtual reality lesson, and then they were given a post-test. And what we saw out of that pre-post methodology was the students performed by almost a full letter grade, period. That is the start and stop. I will tell you, as the person who authored this curriculum, I was quite nervous when we were getting the data back in. And then I was very, very excited and kind of shocked to see the magnitude of learning outcome improvement that our students were seeing. Because if you have read the education literature about different types of interventions that people do, this is a big deal. And from the retention standpoint, a letter grade is actually the dividing line between students staying or leaving STEM fields. So if you can bump a C student to a B student, their likelihood to stay in the STEM field increases substantially. And so the full letter grade was what we saw in the pre-post methodology. It's also what we saw in the experimental and control split, where on average, the students did a letter grade better than the control group when they used added VR to their curriculum. In that experimental and control split, one of the nice things we were able to do was examine if we graded that whole group on a single curve, how many of the students who used VR would have failed. We saw that the failure rate dropped to 0 for that experimental group for this particular lesson. And most exciting from the standpoint of retention and increasing access to STEM concepts, we're pulling the C, D, and F students up by nearly 300% in terms of their quantitative learning outcomes. And so the people who we know need remediation are improving the most from this type of activity. And then we also asked the students how they felt about the lesson and whether they wanted to see virtual reality as part of their curriculum moving forward. We saw was 100% of the students said, yes, they'd love to see VR integrated into their chemistry class. 92% of them said that if they had access, they would have continued to use that lesson to study outside of class time. And so this was really exciting to us, both from the quantitative learning outcome improvements, but also from the perspective that the students really seem to enjoy this. And I would say qualitatively, I have taught this lesson on quantum mechanics for 10 years. Students never walk out of my lecture excited about this topical material. But when they walk away from the VR, they're standing together in groups. They're walking down the hallway talking about how cool the different orbitals were, what they saw inside of them, all of the things you would want if you had delivered a fantastic lecture to your students. We also looked at the ability for this, what percentage of the students showed a degree of improvement. 92% of the students who took the pre-post test showed some degree of improvement. The only demographic data that we collected was gender, and we didn't see any gender dependency in the students. And then the other, I guess, demographic information was we asked the students' ages. And because this pilot activity ran from a summer session all the way through a fall semester, we were able to get a really kind of unique cross-section of the students who come in the summer section, varied in age ranges from 16-year-olds all the way up to 26-year-olds. And people who were there to either fulfill a college requirement early in the case of some of the younger students, or were post-baccalaureates coming back to take requirements for a pre-health program. And so we saw that we didn't see any effect of age or education level on the students. And then at the bottom is the data that I talked about where we did the experimental and control split and looked at if we graded this on a single curve, how would students perform. And we see that there's a significant movement of the average to the higher grades in the case when we add the Soma VR lesson. We also asked the students, so we had, from our very inception, been very focused on STEM, but we asked the students what other courses they were taking or had taken that they thought virtual reality would be a useful complement to. And we were quite pleased to see that all of the STEM subjects, so this is a word cloud based on their answers. The STEM subjects are big and bold. It's the more frequency it was requested, the larger the word is in this cloud. But what's also exciting is we see that the students recognize the potential across a huge array of subjects, from art to criminology to geography, et cetera, and psychology. And so this really reinforced our model, which is to build an initial set of content, but then build the tools that let instructors scale that content out really broadly. So I want to talk a little bit about that process that I just mentioned. How do we build the content that your individual instructors want? And the way that we do that is the Soma VR learning platform. So far, I've talked a lot about VR content. So our approach to content is lesson-based curriculum that are delivered in targeted chunks. So we really target kind of 30-minute lessons once per week is what we think the ideal frequency is, and that seems to be reinforced by the data we've been collecting on the students. We are starting by building out a content library that Soma is creating, and then looking to partner with other schools and professors to extend that content library into other subject areas. All of that content is built on the learning taxonomy that we developed, informed by data science, spatial computing, and education theory. And because we have that taxonomy, as the students are pathing through the lesson, we're collecting data on what they're doing. And because we have integrated assessments in the lesson, we're collecting data on how they're performing. And then we're using those two coupled together, using artificial intelligence and machine learning to develop an insights engine, which will inform the professor as to what are the areas the students need help with, where did they do successfully, but it also lets us get real-time information about the student level of mastery from more than just what questions they answered right. It's based on everything the student is doing in the lesson, to how they accomplish the active learning exercises, to how they answer assessment. The other component of the Sama Learning Platform is the social community. So we know that students do better when they work together, when they can have student-to-instructor interactions, when they can have student-to-student interactions or student-to-tutor interactions. And one of the things that VR really, really naturally lets us do that's a little more challenging from typical online delivery is that we can build shared virtual spaces where students can be together in the same virtual space, learning and talking to each other. So those three components together give us a really great way to deliver content, deliver feedback, but they also give us a way to scale the content out into a huge number of subject areas. And so the way that we are doing that is building a content creation tool chain. And that's going to be a tool that allows instructors without technical knowledge of Unity to use the physics engines, the models, the simulations, the test structure that we've built, and the learning framework to tutorialize the process of building a virtual reality lesson or virtual reality curriculum for their own specific needs. As I mentioned before, we started with general chemistry, so that's phase 1. Right now we have the first 6 lessons that are the first semester of general chemistry. That's our first product offering that exists today. That is going to be followed up by extensions into the other STEM general education curriculum, first semester biology, first semester physics, and the second semester of chemistry. And then phase 3 will be completing that general education core STEM curriculum by rounding out physics, biology, moving into organic chemistry, because we know that's a big pain point for our pre-health students, and calculus as a tool. And our model for curriculum development, as I mentioned, is to have a content expert in the room. Usually it's more than one. So for the Chemistry 101 curriculum, as an example, we engaged with instructors across those 3 pilot schools, and they helped in the creation of that content. And so we're always looking for engaged, excited early adopters who want to be part of the curriculum development process for these other subjects that are coming out in phase 2 and phase 3. So the Insights Engine also lets us build student and teacher portals. So this allows us to give feedback to the instructors on the class level status. So out of the specific learning objectives that are targeted for that lesson, what is the aggregate level of student mastery for their students? We can give direct feedback to the students on what they struggled with and what they did well with to help in that metacognition. We can give feedback through the learning management system. And so we can tailor instructor and student views for that. So I thought I was running a little long, but I am, I guess, right on time. So what's next? So what we are doing, as I mentioned, is we have that general chemistry first semester curriculum exists today, and we are always excited to come out to any school and schedule a demo day and demo to your instructional technologists, curriculum designers, students, administrators, instructors. Really, what we always find is a lot of times it's hard to really understand what is so valuable about being in these virtual lessons and virtual simulations when you've maybe played with 3D digital tools in the past. And the best way to understand that is to throw a headset on your face. And I'm so grateful for all of you who are out at DECI and did exactly that. And if you want to share that experience with your with the stakeholders at your institution, please just reach out to myself or Barb, and we will be there. Additionally, we have our Spring 2020 pilot program. So we're looking for schools that want to participate in that, and we're rolling out that general chemistry curriculum broadly at a number of institutions, at this point ranging all the way from Texas and Colorado right back home to California. And lastly, I'll mention that we're also looking for schools that are interested in using the virtual reality lessons that we've built as a tool to record content for their online curriculums. And that's a separate pilot program that we're beginning right now. And if you're interested in understanding how we can put an instructor in VR and capture and record their lecture in VR and use that as a tool for creating online content for courses, please reach out to myself or Barb as well. And thank you all so much for your time.